We turn our attention now to blues rock, and I'm going to divide that into British blues rock and American blues rock in terms of this discussion. As I said in the first video, all of these styles are sort of grounded in things that happened in the 60s. And blues rock is one of the ones that's easiest to see its roots because, of course, we talked about blues rock a lot in the History of Rock Part 1. Groups like the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds, who in the early 1960s and into the mid-1960s kind of revived the Chicago electric blues tradition as part of the British invasion. And so that continued. In fact, one of the groups we're going to talk about, Led Zeppelin, essentially sort of developed out of the Yardbirds, but we're getting a little bit ahead of our story. We'll start talking about the English groups and then move on to the American groups, and that's partly because in many ways the American blues rock bands, it seems ironic that this should be the case, but the American blues rock bands actually are very influenced by the British blues rock bands. You would think that the American blues rock bands would be influenced by blues in America, but actually many of them were sort of introduced to American blues by the British musicians who came over in the 60s. So we'll deal with the American blues rock bands second. And then we'll ask the question, when it comes to blues influences, what counts as blues rock? Does somebody like ZZ Top count as blues rock, or somebody like Santana? So let's see what we come up with here. Let's turn to blues-based British rock. As I said just a minute ago, blues-based rock coming out of Britain is very much based on a 60s interest in American blues. So this would be primarily the recordings coming out of Chess Records in Chicago in the 1950s. We're talking about Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Little Walter, Bo Diddley, even records by Chuck Berry, all coming off that Chess Records and having a real kind of gritty feel to them, and a real sense of authenticity that a lot of the British artists in the 60s were really drawn to. When they started to do blues rock, initially they did it by imitating those records, trying to sound as much like those records as they could, but they developed a kind of a different approach to the music in part of sort of engaging tradition, and really came up with something that's really easily separable from American blues of the 50s. British blues rock is clearly influenced by it, but really becomes its own thing, and that's what continues out. So as we said before, the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, and then into the late 1960s, Cream with Eric Clapton, very important. So as we talk about British blues rock, I'm only going to have a chance to talk about a few of those groups. So those of you who are waiting for me to talk about, in fact, this goes for the whole class. If you're waiting for me to talk about your favorite group, and I don't, it's not because I don't think that they're an important group or worthy of notice. It's just because that we're condensing material down. So if you don't hear something about your favorite group and you want to make a contribution to it, the discussion forums are a perfect place for you to bring that up and plead your case for a group that you don't think that I've spent enough time on or didn't get a chance to get to. So I'm going to try to choose representative examples. So just understand that they're just representative examples and they don't define or aren't better than other groups and this kind of thing. So we'll start, of course, with blues rock in the 70s. We've got to start with Led Zeppelin. Their roots, of course, in the Yardbirds. Jimmy Page having been sort of the last man standing from the Yardbirds after he was sort of one of the last ones into the group. Everybody else had quit. He was left holding the bag with the band name and a bunch of gigs that they were supposed to play. He brings in a friend of his who was also a studio musician in London during the 60s, John Paul Jones, who played bass and keyboards for the group, and two guys who were relatively unknown, young Robert Plant on lead vocals and John Bonham on drums. And together, these four guys started out as if they were going to be the new Yardbirds, but then changed the name to Led Zeppelin. The first two albums actually being released in 1969, and in many ways, you can still see late 1960s psychedelia in the music of Led Zeppelin, and so it's very easy to sort of follow that transformation. Clearly, their roots are in the blues. A friend of mine has published an article in which he basically tracks the first 4 Led Zeppelin albums, and there's hardly a song there that isn't based on some other song. I'm sure you know that in the case of Led Zeppelin, there's been litigation and copyright infringement kind of suits that have been settled and out of court and this kind of thing. So it's really clear that more than just influences here. To a certain extent, they were Jimmy Page was grabbing tunes that were very much part of the blues repertoire. He would argue that those songs didn't belong to anybody. They were part of a sort of common vernacular that a lot of people re-recorded, and so there was no real crime in putting his name, Robert Plant's name, along with them. I'll let you decide about that, but the one thing that's clear are the influences in blues. Also in folk, they were very influenced by folk and, of course, psychedelia. So if you want to hear a representative track of this, early on from Led Zeppelin, listen to Whole Lotta Love. I'm sure you've heard it plenty of times from 1969, Whole Lotta Love. But listen to the very center section of the tune. The outer portions of the tune are clearly based on a blues lick, right? That part of it really sort of gives us the blues connection there and the lyrics that go with it and Robert Plant singing. But the center part is this almost sort of psychedelic kind of deal. And if you listen to it with the headphones, you can hear, early stereo with them panning sounds from left to right, like they seem to go through your head. Oh, wow, groovy, this kind of thing. And it just really a sort of an atmospheric sort of center section there that is very much a late artifact of psychedelia, remembering that the album that it's on was released in 1969. But the tune that probably is most emblematic of Led Zeppelin, people will argue this, what the most emblematic tune is, but really Stairway to Heaven has really got to be thought of as that tune, I think. If by nothing else, by sheer popularity. I read a statistic once that said that somewhere in the world, some radio station is playing Stairway to Heaven at every single second of the day. So it's a song that never stops being played and being programmed. The tune itself brings together a lot of what we're talking about. There's definitely a kind of a blues tendency at the very end. The aggressive section at the very end of the tune is very sort of blues-based. Think of the guitar solo that launches into the second half of that. The beginning of it, however, is much more sort of cosmic and folk-oriented, starting with a single acoustic guitar. The lyrics are a little bit more sort of philosophical and get away from sort of love relationships and sexual relationships into things that are, vaguely philosophical and this kind of thing. So you see even in a group that sort of trades in a kind of hard-driving kind of blues sound, you see a kind of a conceptual nature of what's going on, especially in that 4th album, sometimes called Four Symbols, sometimes called Zoso, sometimes simply called Led Zeppelin 4. That album that Stairway to Heaven is on, for a conceptual kind of thing. Sort of partners to Led Zeppelin and big in the United States, but really big in Europe, is a group called Deep Purple, who featured keyboardist John Lord, who had sort of classical training, a la somebody who we'll be talking about later, Keith Emerson or Rick Wakeman, or one of those classically trained keyboard players. And guitarist Ritchie Blackmore, who was one of the first important virtuoso guitarists after Hendrix and Eric Clapton, and had been a studio musician in the 1960s, working especially for Joe Meek during the mid-1960s with a group called the Outlaws, and also Screaming Lord Sutch. So Ritchie Blackmore, already somebody sort of known on the music scene when Deep Purple came together at the end of the 1960s, had a pretty big hit with a song called Hush, a song originally done by Joe South. It was a #4 hit in this country in 1968. They really bridge Deep Purple really is the bridge between psychedelia of the late 60s and what's going to develop into heavy metal at the end of the 1970s. At this point, groups like Deep Purple, groups like Black Sabbath, who we'll talk about in a minute, aren't really thought of as heavy metal, as if heavy metal were something separable from the rest of what was going on in rock and roll. They were still thought of as blues rock acts. It wouldn't really sort of, the idea of what heavy metal is separate from everything else wouldn't really sort of crystallize until the second half of the decade. But anyway, when you think about Deep Purple, if you're looking for a representative album of what they do, Machine Head from 1972 is probably the best representative. That's got Smoke on the Water on it, for example. Another one of those tunes like Stairway to Heaven that always seems to be playing on some radio station somewhere in the world at all times. You've got a track on there called Lazy, which really shows the group's blues blues influences. Highway Star is a fantastic track that shows some of their classical influences. So when you think about Deep Purple, I think there's in comparison with Led Zeppelin, both are blues-based groups, but there's a little bit more emphasis in the Deep Purple sound toward quotations of classical music and this kind of thing. Of course, the lead singer in that group, Ian Gillan, sort of perfected the idea of the kind of rock and roll scream, the high scream. You can hear that in certainly in Highway Star, and you can hear that in Space Truckin' as well. All of these things, the Ritchie Blackmore virtuosity, the references to classical music, the sort of high scream and all that kind of thing will all become sort of prototypical elements of heavy metal as it develops. And the third of our sort of triumvirate of British blues-based groups is Black Sabbath. Of course, when we talk about the roots of heavy metal, Black Sabbath is probably that group that is really sort of most often cited in that regard. The group started out, like so many of these British groups, as a blues-based group. They decided to go in the direction of sort of specializing in this sort of scary gothic horror kind of thing, and got their name from a movie called Black Sabbath that featured horror film icon Boris Karloff. The movie's from 1963. It's actually an anthology of 3 films together, but nevertheless, Black Sabbath. Check it out on the internet. You'll be able to find the movie poster for that. And as I say, blues-based, but with the sort of gothic penchant, this thing for sort of things dark. Ozzy Osbourne has said in interviews, the lead singer of the group, Ozzy Osbourne, has said in interviews a couple times that, you know, in the late 60s in California it was flower power and sunshine, but they were in Birmingham, in the north of England. Birmingham wasn't sunshine, it wasn't flower power, it was dark, it was dirty, and the whole sort of dark side of psychedelia comes out in this. Probably the archetypal album for Black Sabbath before Ozzy leaves the group in 1979 is Paranoid. It's their second album from 1970, and it's got such tracks on it as Iron Man and War Pigs, the ones that saturated FM radio in the early 1970s and really made a name for the group. Well, now we've talked about British blues-based rock. In the next video, let's turn to the American blues-based bands.